to presume your utility function. That is, I am going to presume that your goal is the international standard. This is the International School of Economics. And the international standard is to maximize the impact of your work. That means that quality is preferred to quantity. I realize that may go against local, I said Central European, but South Caucasian standards. It is amazing when we put people up for tenure or promotion to docent or professor at SIR-GI. The biggest fight we have with the Charles University powers that be is persuading them that there is actually a difference between the American Economic Review and the Armenian Economic Review, and you should give more weight to the number of papers published in high-quality journals than simply the number of papers published. And, Charles University, almost op-eds in news. You guys would all get tenure because the ISET blog would count as a publication. I don't know how the Georgian rules are, but seriously, they count blogs in op-eds in newspapers about equivalent to every journal article. So I'm not going to be looking at that. I'm going to assume the IFC ISET standard that you really want to get good quality papers accepted. Which of course means, and this is not telling you anything you don't know, but I see this happen. And for those of you, I'm glad to see a lot of ISET PI people as well as ISET faculty members here. I mean, I know that Muhammad and Roberto have internalized this, but for the others, or Michael and Adam, yes, but for the others, there is a real hierarchy of outlets. If you can, you want to be in one of the top general interest journals. Journals that are read by all economists, not simply those in a particular field. General interest journals, the Journal of Political Economy, the QJE, the EJ, those are the sine qua non, right? Those are the thing to aspire to. Now, obviously, ISET tenure and promotion and retention standards are not going to be the same as MIT or Penn or Harvard. If you're playing at a top 20 institution in Europe or the US, they're going to demand at least one publication in those journals for tenure. Then generally the best field journals are where you want to head, right? Generally, if you're not going to hit one of the top 5, 6, 7 general interest journals, then you want the very best journal in your field, the Journal of Labor Economics, the Journal of Development Economics. You all know in your field what are the places to hit for. Then other journals, okay? Only if you don't make any journal at all do you want to publish your work in a book. And this is where economics is so different from other fields. We give almost no credit for books, publications, even chapters in books, okay? And finally, conference volumes, Feist, things like that. Everybody knows the way the game is played. All senior economists have a drawer full of papers that they've never published. And when somebody calls and says, I'm doing an honorary volume for the retirement of so-and-so, we say, oh, good, here I can pull out this paper that I've never published anywhere else. And so you will get tarred with the same feather if that's the kind of world you are publishing in. Now, why? Why do journals count in so much more than books? Somebody take a guess. Don't make me call on you, or I will. Kareem.
They are read more often, they are cited more often.
They're read more often, they're cited more often. Why are they read and cited more often?
Because they are shorter.
Oh, great, we've got an audience here. Think about the incentives, not necessarily shorter. Book chapters and journal articles might be about the same length. But always, if you're an economist, what's the first question you ask yourself? What are the incentives? Journal editors are looking for something new and worthwhile. Book editors are looking for something that they can sell. Those are not perfectly correlated. And the profession has internalized that the journal editor has a congruence of interest more in having frontier work. The book editor has a congruence of interest more in lines with something that meets popular demand, which is probably not frontier work.
But why not that happens in other sciences?
What?
Why doesn't that happen in other sciences, like political science or whatever? Reporting stuff?
Don't get me started on the incentives in political science. It's certainly, maybe that's what makes economics more a hard science than political science, right? It is what happens in biology or chemistry. And I think it's more and more happening in political science or sociology. Okay, I don't know why I need to say this, but I see it over and over and over again in Central and Eastern Europe. Working papers are not publications. Don't let me see an ISET CV that says publications and lists working papers. Working papers are extremely important. And there is also a hierarchy of working papers. Now, one thing that's nice about working papers is, unlike journals, and I may mention this again, there is no prohibition against publishing the same research in as many working paper series as you have access to. If I have a new working paper, I will send it to the Surge working paper series, the Hunter working paper series, the IZA working paper series, the ISET working paper series. Is there one?
Yes.
Okay, well, you should remind me to send you papers. The Armenian, I can send it to 6 working paper series at the same time, identical paper, and nobody will complain. Journals, you will show up on the plagiar. There is a website devoted to finding people who've published the same paper in 2 different journals.
Bruno Fry.
What?
Sorry, I said Bruno Fry. More than 2 journals. Far more than 2 journals.
Or Friedrich Scherer, yes. But at least he changes the wordings. Obviously, within working paper series, the best, if you can do it, is an international series with refereed or with quality control on associates. Okay? Either of those works. Quality control on associates means something like the CEPR working papers, the NBER working papers, the CES-EFO working papers, the ICA working papers, which is why I told people who are connected remotely to ICA, you need to get yourselves on the list, because those working papers will publish immediately. You know, I'm an ICA and a CES-EFO affiliate. If I send them the paper, it goes automatically, because they've assumed that in order to be offered the relationship with NBER or CEPR or IZA, that is the guarantee of quality. If you don't have that guarantee of quality, then you want to look to ones that have a refereeing process, like the Surge EI's working papers. What does that mean for ISET? A piece of advice that even if it's not a totally rigorous process, even if it happens quickly, even if it happens in-house, one, you need to get the ISET working papers listed in EconLit, REPEC, if they're not listed already. And it would help if you put in place some kind of quick review process so that it could be said, somebody other than the author has read this paper and said, yes, it is of ISET quality. That will give the series more credibility. Piece of advice for whoever, who is responsible for the ISET working papers?
We are.
Who we?
Well, ultimately, it's just the IT department. They put it on the webpage, and then it's
But they're
automatically linked to
responsible
WeChat.
technically.
They're responsible technically, but so if anybody sends anything, it counts, it gets accepted, or is there somebody
Well, maybe
saying?
not anyone, but
Okay.
Well, so if a
sends it.
faculty member sends it, they just approve it.
Now, it is critical. First secret of publication success. Get your papers out as working papers as soon as you can. Why?
Somebody else will write about it.
Exactly. You have to establish priority for your ideas. And the economics literature is full of examples of people who didn't do this and lived to regret it. I'll give you a few. But good ideas, if an idea is one that you see, unless it is something where only you have access to the data, you can assume in today's world that there are dozens of graduate students and junior faculty everywhere thinking the same idea. And there's very little reward for being second. Everybody knows Heckman sample selection correction, right? All students are taught to do a Heckman correction.
I always refer to it as Grunow.
Grunow gets second choice, but the guy who did it first is actually Lung Fei Li. But he didn't claim it. It's in his doctoral dissertation at the University of Rochester. And I'll tell a personal story. I published one of the first papers using Heckman sample selection correction in the JPE way back in the 1980s. And it was one of these where I had to take over the whole university computer for 2 days just to get what you could now do on your phone. And I sent it to the JPE. This was a paper about the earnings of artists. And the only comment I got from the editor, who happened to be Jim Heckman, was, take out the reference to Lung Fei Li and put in the reference to Jim Heckman. And Lung Fei, he's a brilliant econometrician, but how many of you have actually heard of Lung Fei Li? Right? If he claimed sample selection corrections, we'd all be talking about Lee corrections. Other examples. Oaxaca, Blinder, decomposition of wages. Those were actually published simultaneously the same month in 2 different journals.
1973.
Yeah. Both Oaxaca and Blinder came up with the idea. They didn't know, but because it wasn't an internet world, right? In today's world, you can assume that somebody's got it on the internet and you better claim it. These guys independently developed the idea, sent it to 2 different journals, got it accepted, and the journals hit the subscriptions the same month.
In my class, I call it Oaxaca Blinder test.
What?
In my class, I combine them.
Good for you.
Oaxaca Blinder.
Now, the really frustrated guy, Arrow-Debreu general equilibrium. Lionel Mackenzie could have claimed it, but Hukukani Nakado actually did it first, but he published it in Japanese. Do not publish a fundamental concept of economics in Japanese. Second hint, because you'll never, right? We'd all be talking about Nakado equilibrium if he published it in English. Okay, so I've made the point. Get the working paper out there.
But Randy, I have a question. And if you look at an NBER working paper,
Right.
those papers are so polished, and there's so little difference between the NBER working paper version and the final journal version. And so it seems that a lot of people are usually having a very, very polished paper before they make it a working paper, or it's a very short process between, say, NBER working paper series and QJE or something like that.
Look very carefully at the footnotes because those papers are revised and keep the same number. So, for example, my ICA 2012 paper, I'm going to send them a new version next week. And it'll show up with the same title, but it'll say revision of 2014 on it. Yeah, the bureau papers tend to be a little more polished. And if you actually Google scholar search, what a lot of people will do is dump an early version on their university working paper series site and then wait for a final version to put it on the NBER site. So again, if you have access to multiple sites, I would put it early on the ISET working paper site. Remember to revise it. Don't leave the old one up there when you've got a new revision. But then you wait for a revision or two before it goes on the ICA site. By the way, that's reminding me, I don't know if I'll come back to this or not. So I'll tell the story now. One of my colleagues in Prague is doing a very fascinating but extremely discouraging piece of research for young scholars. The NBER Working Papers sends a weekly blast to NBER affiliates of the new papers that have come in the last week. It's purely random what number they're assigned. They're assigned a number in the order that they show up on the editor's email account. But being first on the weekly blast increases citations by 30%.
Luck.
Huh?
Luck.
Pure luck. This is about as random an experiment as you can get. There is no evidence that papers that are first on the weekly blast are substantive any better. But it says something about the attention span of economists that they read the first couple of papers on the weekly blast, and by the time that they may not read the end, it's filed away, and months later they cite the ones that were earlier. Research idea. I haven't seen anybody yet check whether having focal point numbers in the working paper series increases citations. That might be a good master's thesis. Does NBER working paper number 6500 get more citations than 6503? The refereeing process. Again, nothing that anybody doesn't know, but to think about some things. Almost all journals now referee papers. A minority do a pre-screen with the editors rejecting papers, and I've got some numbers in a minute. But in the best economic journals, over 75% of submissions get 2 or more referee reports. So even including desk rejections or 1 referee report only, that's less than 25% of papers. JET, the Journal of Economic Theory, is the exception. It typically uses only 1 referee. All refereeing, I think now, with minor exceptions, is single blind. That is, the author doesn't know who the referee is. 90% of journals claim that the refereeing is double blind, but don't believe it. That is, you don't know, the referee doesn't know who the author is. The author doesn't know who the referee is. But with the internet and working papers, any referee can find out who the author is if they want.
And then the author can smell the referee.
Hmm?
And then the author can smell the referee.
Often the author can smell the referee, particularly if the referee's comment is replace Lundfaley with Jim Hackman. Then it's pretty obvious who the referee is. We've been trying an experiment, some of my friends and I.
Accent of the referee in my report.
Yes, look for the English. Some of my friends and I have been trying an experiment not violating the principle of blind refereeing, that is, refereeing papers, sending in the report, and then seeing if we can identify the author. We've got 90% hit rates. And I once told an author that I knew who they were. I got so frustrated with a paper I was refereeing because it was a paper I wanted to see published, basically on the frequency of purchased doctoral dissertations in Russia and Ukraine. By the way, those of you who are wondering how ISET can finance itself, you know what the going rate for a purchased doctoral dissertation in Russia is?
$20,000.
$20,000 plus. That's just the first submission. If you want the complete,
Yes.
if you want the complete package, including the articles needed for CSC and the habilitation article, The quoted price is $60,000. And there are over 200 firms advertising that they will write your dissertation for you. Not plagiarize it, but write original research for sale. So if ISET ever has financial problems, we're putting in the contract, Eric, that every PEI member and every faculty member has to sell one dissertation in the Soviet market every year. And I think we're set for life.
What if they demand them in Russian?
We can hire a translator for that.
This amount of money we can do it.
What I don't know, here's another research paper for people, is those are the quoted prices. Nobody, to my knowledge, has actually analyzed it as a holdup problem. Once you get halfway through the dissertation, do they try and renegotiate the price? Okay, anyway. I wanted this paper published, and I had gotten revise and resubmit 4 times, and it was not getting to publishable status, so I finally just wrote to the editor and said, look, I know who this author is. It's a graduate student at this university. He has a faculty advisor who can speak English, and I am not reviewing this paper again until it's got a co-author who knows how to write it and sell it. Okay, numbers for referees per submission. Again, this is per submission. The mean number of referees and the percentage with more than one referee of submission. Notice that we're right around 2, except for the JET, which only has 50% with more than one referee. Most papers are going to get at least 2 referees.
This is in the group which is not disk rejected, right? For all.
No.
All submissions.
The mean number of referees is conditional on going to referees, but the number with more than one referee includes the desk rejections.
This is too high number. Big number.
No?
I believe it's overestimated. It's huge.
Well, that's what the journals report.
They lie. I know about disk rejection.
Now, the number of reports is endogenous to the editor's priors. So look at the editorial board of the journal before you submit. You can pretty well guess who's going to be handling your paper. And if you know that they don't like the kind of research that you're doing, don't send it there. However, this is prepare to be totally discouraged. There is an incredibly large stochastic element to referee. Somebody actually did a research project looking at the inter-referee correlation. Referees not only make comments, but they generally give an editor a recommendation: accept this paper, reject this paper, possibly think about this paper, revise this paper, or accept this paper. Among papers that had 2 or more referees, what do you think the correlation across those 4 categories is?
Not very high.
0.2. 0.2. So, expect a stochastic process. What?
Who has calculated this?
I forget the name of the researcher. I can find the reference, but it was seriously done. It was a decent study. Who referees papers? This is what you can expect. Referees tend to be at the peak of their careers. Among reputable economics journals, those that you want to publish in, say the top 100, the average age is about 45. The average referee for journals, again, about the top 100, has been cited 23 times a year. So generally the profession is using serious scholars for the refereeing process. The quality is directly related to journal qualities. And this is something you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about your optimal publication and submission strategy. If I look at impact of referees, because a lot of journals publish now the list of people that they thank for refereeing during the year. So somebody has sat down and looked at the REPEC rankings of the journal's referees related to the impact factor of the journal, and that's very significantly correlated. So the better the journal in terms of impact factor, the better the referees that you can expect from that journal on average. Now, moving away from averages, who's going to referee your paper? What's the most important determinant?
Or the bibliography, whom you cite.
Whom you cited. Journal editors typically look at the paper briefly, look at the bibliography, and say, who do I know here who might be able to tell me something about this? Who owes me a favor in this bibliography?
So it's good to cite people who already died.
No, it's good to cite people you think will like your work, right? If you've got a choice, right, you're not going to cite everything. You can manipulate the process. Secret number X. Pick in the bibliography some people that you think might be sympathetic. Not friends of yours. They're not going to send it to your thesis advisor. No matter how many times Roberto cites Hartmut, he's not going to referee the paper typically. What's the second biggest predictor of who's going to referee the paper?
What topic? The field.
Who you didn't cite.
Oh, I see.
If the editor knows that there is an obvious person in the field that you left out.
But that is a very bad start, actually.
What?
It's a very bad start. People tend to get upset if they're not cited.
Well,
Exactly.
the first guy will say review and submit. The second guy will say absolutely reject. And then you got 100% correlation between everything.
But you do need to be careful, because if there is an obvious expert in the field whom you think might disagree, leaving them out of the bibliography increases the odds that the editor is going to say, why isn't she there? I better send this paper to her. And the third thing, obviously, is the odds of somebody being chosen to referee your paper go up substantially if they've published in that journal recently. Okay? So you can manipulate a little bit. So if you're trying to decide where to send your paper, if there is somebody you think would be sympathetic to what you're doing, and they've recently published in a journal, if you've got two journals you're indifferent between, and that's often the case, right? Should I send my paper to, okay, we all know I'll take labor as an example. We all know that the Journal of Labor Economics is the premier journal. But if you go a level below that, should I send it to the Journal of Human Resources, the Industrial and Labor Relations Review, Labor Economics with a U? There are arguments for all of them. I might pick the one where somebody who might be sympathetic to my research has recently published over the one where nobody I think is sympathetic to my research has recently published, just because that might enable me a little bit to manipulate who the referees are. See the point? So it's okay to leave names you only know slightly out of the acknowledgments, but don't try and manipulate the selection by thanking people you think would disagree with you. Right, referees don't tend to send papers to somebody who's thanked in the acknowledgments. So if you thank me for your consultation on your paper, I'm not going to get it to referee. I've seen people try and play a game by thanking people they barely met, maybe talked to in the hall at a conference, because they don't want them to be selected to be the referee. That's not kosher. Lags in economics are getting longer. I haven't updated this graph, but if I took it out for the next 10 years, you won't have seen Does this thing have a pointer? Yes. You won't have seen much of a change. The trend line is still going that way. I need to update this graph, but we know what's going on here. Now, why? Why are lags getting longer? There's been a big increase in the first response time of journals. In 1960, it took between 1 and 2 months on average for an editor to get back to an author. Now, when I was coming out of graduate school, it took between 3 and 4 months. Now, the average is between 4 and 6 months. If you hear back from an editor in less than 4 months or 5 months, you're lucky. Look at this. In 1970, in the whole period between 1940 and 1970, the average number of revisions among accepted papers was less than a half. Now, the average number of revisions in accepted papers at the journal it's accepted at is more than 2. And authors are taking longer to revise. Again, in the old days, when Nicky and I were children, authors got back in a couple of months. Now, authors are taking more than 4 months to revise. Now that is influenced. I don't know how they dealt with the truncation of the infinite number of months. I'm looking at Adam right now. No. But open papers, revise and resubmits, sometimes they're much longer than that. Now, why the slowdown in all of these levels? First of all, there's increased democratization. Journals are simply getting far more papers than they used to, which is clogging the reviewing process. And those numbers from 1960, 70, it was an in-house thing. You were you were an economic journal in-house person, you sent something to the EJ. Now everybody everywhere in the world thinks, I should submit my paper to EJ or JPE or Restat. So they're having to deal with far more papers. There's also increased specialization. That means it's harder to find referees. In the old days, Keynes wrote the general theory. So he just reviewed everything that came to the economic journal. And Keynes thought he could review everything that came to the economic journal. Nowadays, editors know that they have to find a referee who understands. Increased complexity, particularly increased mathematics. And that makes it harder. Anybody, general interest, can think, I can read, right? Papers were rejected up until about 1970 in economics if they had math in them. Think about it. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting, but there's a famous story. I'm senile, I forget the name, but there's a famous story of the AER sometime in the 50s or 60s that refused to publish a paper because it had the notation X bar in it and they didn't have typesetting for X bar. Okay, this is the same increased competition, increased democratization. And editors know that the cost of revision has fallen, which makes them much more willing to ask for revisions. Right? When I did the JPE paper with Heckman's selection, an editor would know that if she wrote back and said, why don't you try adding this variable to the equation? I was going to have to reserve a computer for 3 nights again. Nowadays, they feel free. I'd like you to rewrite this wording on this. Well, heck, that's just changing your word processor. You don't have to go back to a manual typewriter and retype the whole paper.
Yeah, I'm curious about this reduced cost of revision because now it seems that editors want more data, more analysis, and you have multiple co-authors, longer papers, and it seems
We're getting to that, yes.
yeah, it seems still kind of costly. Like finding mining data from the Democratic Republic of the Congo that took 4 months.
Right.
So,
Finding more data can be, but think about it again. That's something that they think they can ask for now because it is conceivable that you can do it. When it was very difficult. Again, I'm going back to the days where if you ran another regression, you had to stay up all night long and go handle punch cards, right? You had to enter all that data by punch card and then go sit in the computer center. And I would think to myself, well, is it really worth it as a referee to ask Adam to try another variable or another specification because I knew how much that was going to cost him. Now I don't have any problem at all. In any case, you have to recognize that the optimal response time for refereeing is not 0 and it never will be. Right? Imagine from your point of view as an author, what would you like to do? You'd like to get a response within 48 hours. But think about the journal's point of view. If they were giving responses within 48 hours, everybody would start sending papers to every journal possible, starting with the best. It would simply, right? If you knew you could get an answer from the JPE in 48 hours and another answer 48 hours later from Restat and another answer 48 hours from EJ, everybody would send every paper to the best journal and it would work all the way down the tree and they would have an infinite number of submissions. So there's always going to be some equilibrium where journal editors don't push the process to 0 response time because that will just get them too many inappropriate papers. They need to impose a cost on the authors to think about where is appropriate as a journal. That game is always going on and you need to be aware of it. We do have research that if you provide incentive to referees, and this is, you need to think about this when you can tell because it's public policy, whether a journal provides a cash incentive or social stigma. There are journals that publish referees that are delayed with reports. You know that those journals will get you a quicker review, but not as good a review. Not as good meaning in less depth. So you'll get fewer comments quicker if you send to a journal that pays its referees. And it's a discontinuous, referees who are at the peak of their economics career, a $100 check from a journal is not significant income. But it does affect response time. If I say I'll give you $100 if you respond within 30 days, the tendency is for referees to write at 29 days, but write what they can do quickly because the deadline is on them. Now that may affect where you choose to submit, because you're playing a game. If you've got a tenure review coming up and having an acceptance is extremely important, then maybe you do send it to a journal where you're going to get quick turnaround even if you don't get very substantive reviews. But if you're sending a paper that you think, we'll talk in a minute about sequencing of journals. If you're sending a paper that you think, well, there's a low probability it'll be accepted, but I want to try this journal because I think I'll get great criticisms, and you're at the beginning of your academic career and you've got 6 years, then maybe you don't pick one that's going to give you a very quick turnaround with less quality reviews. So it's a difficult trade-off, right? You, as a scholar, are trying to maximize some function of the reputation of the outlet, that means the attention of your work to your work, the quality of the refereeing you're going to get, because most papers are rejected, but if it's rejected with good referee comments, the probability of acceptance the next time around goes up. The probability of acceptance and the lag time. All of those are in your objective function, and you need to actually think about all of those for any journal that you're thinking about submitting to. And there are websites you can look up all of those. Economics is the worst field. This is hard to read, but I cut the average publication time from submission to publication in months for different professions. Chemistry, about 9 months. Of accepted papers from submission to publication, of the subset that is accepted. Business and economics, 30 months.
Decimal science.
What?
Decimal science, right? Nothing changed about that.
Decimal science. So you should all move to physics, where it's only 11 months.
How much is it in medicine?
Uh,
Must be the shortest.
Chemistry was short.
Medicine isn't on here. These are sciences. So chemistry, engineering,
Medicine, the papers are also very short.
very short and very quick.
Because it's about life.
Yeah,
It's not
We
about.
don't have time to lose time.
It's not about correlations.
yeah. Mathematics. Okay, economics, I'm sorry, it's 18. 18 months in economics.
The 30 was too bad.
Yeah, 18.
How is mathematics?
What?
Mathematics? How many months?
13.
Very good.
Earth science, 12. Physics, 11. Engineering, 9. Chemistry, 9.
I'm a baby.
Yeah, about the same as a baby. Now, things may not be quite that bad. Those are the lags between submission and publication of accepted. Now, one thing that's changing is those figures don't include web publication. Most journals now will put a paper, once it's accepted, on the web as an accepted paper long before it shows up in the actual print edition. And most of the increase in time is among accepted papers. But the bad news, acceptance rates are about 6% in the top economics journals and about 15% in good field journals. So if you've been rejected, don't feel bad. That's the norm. You just get used to it. Now that argues for a submission tree, right? We know there's randomness in the process. What I usually recommend to young scholars is you start with 1 or 2 stretch journals, and we've talked about this, some of you. That is, unless you're right up against a tenure deadline or a job market deadline, if you've got some time, pick a couple of 1 or 2 journals where you think the odds are low, but not impossible. And take advantage of the referees in the profession. And this is particularly important for young people sitting at Tbilisi State University, where you're not getting a lot of feedback from senior scholars. One way of guaranteeing that your work is read seriously by the best in the profession is to take advantage of the profession and send it to a decent journal, even if you think the probability is low. Maybe you get lucky. But if you don't get lucky, at least you can probably count on getting real reading and comments. And then submit it to your real target. Right? Talk to me, talk to Paul, talk to Daniel, and we'll tell you, okay, we've read this paper. This is where we think it likely will end up. I mean, I can't predict perfectly. I never can, because of all the stochasticness. But I can tell you what my highest expected probability is. And if you're right up against a tenure deadline, I might say shoot lower than that. I told Karine that yesterday with something. If you've got 6 years, or 5 years, I would say shoot higher than that. But generally, you pick a place that's a stretch journal, maybe a second one, and then you start going to the ones where you think it'll be accepted. Mohammed did this perfectly with the paper that ended up in the Southern Journal eventually. Now, the definition of stretch will vary according to the paper. You don't want to exploit the profession too badly. Right? If it's a paper that there is no chance it'll get in the JPE, don't waste their time or your time or the profession's time sending it there. You know, I can't tell you how many graduate students I see in Prague that say, oh, okay, I'm going to send this to the AER. And I laugh and say, no, your stretch journal for this is the European Economic Review. Now, again, this is what I just said. The optimal sequence depends very much on where you are in your career. So talk to your senior people here, talk to the IFC, talk to the senior visitors, and get some serious advice. We've all played this game. I just said that. Remember, only one journal at a time. I've seen people violate it, and I've seen people who were blackballed in the profession for violating it. There is at least a non-zero probability if you try to cheat and send it to 2 journals at the same time that the same referee will get the paper, and then your career is ruined. Vary your journal choices. Don't always go to the same journals. And important hint that I don't see people do. Look at not only the impact factor of a journal you're sending to, but the change in impact factor. You can get the impact factor of every journal for every year going back now. And you want to be submitting to ones that are going to increase their impact factor over the next few years rather than decrease it. Again, a research project I haven't seen anybody do, but somebody who's looking for a fun master's thesis, what is the intertemporal correlation of changes in impact factors? How much does the year T-1 change predict the year T change? Is it mean reverting or is it a trend? You do that, I'll add you in the slides. And you can remind editors, but when is a ticklish time? Talk to your senior colleague. But editors do lose papers. I've got one now, actually, that's out, and I finally nudged the editor and said, what's happening with this? And he wrote back and said, oops, we need to do an expedited review. We lost the paper. The most important thing to keep in mind, editors, remember that 6% and that 15%. Editors have to have a reason to reject most papers. You don't want to give them an excuse. If you survey editors and ask why they rejected papers, the most common reasons are it didn't make a contribution or the contribution wasn't significant enough for the journal's image. It didn't communicate well. Referees are human beings.
Are they?
Yes.
That's news.
So you need to show why your paper is important. You need to say it. Don't accept that they'll understand why this is critical. You need to show how it extends the literature. You need to make it easy to understand. Don't waste space. Now, I'll show you some figures. As Mohammed said, papers are, or Adam, I forget which, papers are getting longer. But space is still the binding resource constraint on editors. Even online journals recognize that if they don't establish a limit on the number of papers, they can't signal quality. Right? It would be what is a journal's editor's objective function? It is to maximize the impact factor of her journal. And they get more, and that's based on citations. So 2 papers cited 100 times is better than 1 paper cited 125 times. But they have fixed page budgets. If you're the editor of the AER, the association has told, Orly Ashenfelter, who's a good friend of mine, was the editor for 10 years. They told him precisely to plus or minus like 10 pages, how many pages he could publish in a year. So if he accepts a longer paper, the inherent trade-off is he has to accept fewer papers. You have to say in your paper, why you have to do all these things in your paper. You don't write in a cover letter, this is why it's important, because nobody's ever read a cover letter in their life, particularly not the referees. So you want to have a paper that gives some new insight into a fundamental issue in economics. And I can't say this enough. You are in small countries, as Neville Chamberlain would say, of which we know little. You're not going to get a paper published because it says this is the first paper on gender wage differences in Georgia. You're going to get a paper published if you can persuade people that the unique situation in Georgia, well, you may get it published, but not in a very good journal. You want to persuade people that the unique situation in Georgia enables you to say something about a fundamental issue in economics that's more widely interesting. Example from my own research career, a colleague and I published a paper in the Economics of Education Review, which is the leading journal in education economics a couple of years ago. It was on school funding in the Czech Republic. Now, if we had sold it as a paper on school funding in the Czech Republic, I don't think we would have gotten accepted there. But all we had to do was write 2 paragraphs at the introduction saying school funding and voucher funding for schools is an incredibly important issue in the United States. All of the American literature has a problem because the voucher experiments are capped in the number of participants, so there's no marginal effect on school budgets. No state is going to adopt universal vouchers without seeing whether they make a difference or not. Here's a country that looks an awful lot like Ohio in terms of its population size, local government units. It adopted universal vouchers, so when you read Czech Republic from now on, think Ohio. And the paper got accepted, easily. And that's what you want to do with Georgia and Armenia. You've got unique advantages because you have data no one else does, but you've got to think how to put it in a broad context. Does it help resolve a controversy? Can you combine 2 or more literatures? I know I'm running long, but so tell me to stop, but there's some more things here. Even if it's theory related, at least write 3 paragraphs relating it to something in the real world. And don't be overly negative about past work. You can criticize it, but don't say it's CR blank blank, because that person may be the referee. And try to identify topics that are coming in the literature rather than ones that, if you do Google Scholar on the topic and the number of papers is increasing over time, good signal. If the number of papers is decreasing over time, bad signal. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. Don't try and read everything or you'll never get to writing. Put your references everywhere. Particularly, I see graduate students make this mistake. They say, I've done the literature review, now I'm going to discuss my results. And you're making the referee go back and remember what in the table was related to what in the literature. If your results confirm or contradict somebody, say it right in the results so that the referee knows that. Okay, now I'm going to sound like a chauvinist. Presentation matters. The abstract, the introduction need to be critical. Not critical, they are critical. They need to be carefully done. Even the title matters. Most referees form an impression by the time they've gotten to the second page. I like this paper, it's doing something interesting, and then they're looking for reasons to accept it. Or, I'm bored, I'm confused, what the heck is this person saying? Then they're looking for reasons to reject it. And counterbalancing that first impression is extraordinarily difficult. So you need to work very hard to get the referee on your side in the first 3 or 4 pages of the paper. There's got to be a clean, consistent spine. This is a trivial little thing where I'm going to sound imperialistic. I know the English department's going to say, well, you know, that's an old rule, but there are old referees. And even if only 1 in 10 hate it when you write in the first person, if you happen to get that one, they're going to be biased against you, so avoid it. Jan Komenta will never accept a paper that has, I did this. He's just totally persnickety about English. If it says I did it, it's rejected.
The paper does it.
Huh?
The paper does it.
No, he'll also reject that. That's called anthropomorphizing.
So who did it?
We.
We can interpret these results as saying, which means that you and the reader are in it together. Or the results, but you don't say the results tell us, because that means the results are standing there speaking, and results can't speak, they're dead. And Jan will literally reject papers. Like, I've seen him send students back to rewrite theses at the defense stage for that. By the way, this is the mistake I see all the time as a referee. Somehow people seem to think that the last paragraph needs to say, well, what could we do to make this better? And ideas for further extensions or whatever. That is simply begging the referee to say, great, do it and send me a revision. Right? The referee's looking for comments. If your last paragraph is, gee, here's where we would go next, the first thing I'm going to say in my comments is, great, go there. Okay, use enough English. Don't rely on jargon. If it's not widely known, define it. And this is where I'm going to sound imperialistic. Write proper English. You cannot get away with saying, I am not a native speaker, so I will make grammatical errors. Now, why? Because we're imperialists? I've given you the answer here. My graduate students are amazed that referees don't actually check the Stata code. English is a language. Math is a language. Stata is a language. If you make grammatical errors in English, my underlying assumption is, how can I trust that they didn't make coding errors in the data? How can I trust that they didn't make a mistake in the math? I'm not going to retake every derivative as a referee. So I have to assume that you were letter perfect in your derivatives. I have to assume that you were letter perfect in your data manipulation.
I think it's imperialism.
You think it's imperialism?
Because they are all these Indian stata and derivative wizards who would probably have a few English problems, but who would do things better in math and coding.
They should not do economics.
Hmm?
They should not do economics.
Or like the guy who developed the average room model but wrote it in Japanese.
Anyway, I know I'm being forceful here, but I think it does matter. Reference. These slides are all being recorded and everything's being recorded, so that's a good reference for how to write. Figures when you can. Much easier to understand than tables or equations. You can say more in one graph of results than you can in 10 pages of tables.
Do you actually have recommendations for good software to produce a large variety of figures?
A large variety of
different figures, I mean tree diagrams, whatever comes to one's mind. I mean, it seems that they're like sometimes highly specialized programs, but they can only do certain things. But
you know what? I don't have a recommendation because I'm old enough that my graduate students and co-authors do that for me, and I get lots of figures in a LIX file sitting on top of LaTeX, and I don't know what he generated it in. I'll find out. Send me an email and remind me, and I'll find out what my colleagues are doing these days.
yeah, well, I actually have something specific in mind. I will send you an email.
Okay. Piece of advice. Remember, space is the binding constraint. I have found in my own papers and in my students' papers that almost any paper can be cut by a third without sacrificing anything. So when you think you're done, put it away and then go back and say, on each and every sentence, can I say this in a more succinct way? Don't retype material that you can find elsewhere, particularly with the web. Put a reference in. I don't need to see the formula for Heckman corrections now. Nowadays, we used to rely on the footnote that said, These results are available from the author on request. And you prayed that nobody would ever ask for them, because if they did, you'd have to type them up, and 99% of the time you never got them. Nowadays, you have to figure out all the supplemental stuff. Each paper that you do now probably has a website attached to it where you post the results that you're discussing but aren't in the paper. That's just the convention now. The trend is to denser papers. Again, a mistake I see people in Eastern Europe make all the time is to say, oh, gee, I need a lot of papers, so I'm going to take this one idea and try and divide it into 4 papers. The average paper in top journals now is 3 times as long as it was 50 years ago. If an extension or a variation or a robustness check is interesting, put it in the paper. Don't think, oh, gee, I can get a second paper by doing a minor variation on it, because that's going to lower your odds of acceptance. So robustness checks are now critical in getting papers accepted. Partially because the profession is increasingly aware of publication bias. What do I mean by publication bias? Roberto?
Well, the fact that the results that are published tend to be the ones that give significant results.
Right. Remember, all a 95% confidence interval says is that there's 95% there's only a 5% chance that this occurred when there's no relationship. So if I run 100 random regressions, 5 of them are going to show up significant. And if journals only accept significant results and you only submit significant results, then the whole profession falls apart, because all the 95, I once thought we should have a journal that said I'll only publish insignificant results. But now, more and more, the profession is saying, okay, I understand that I really don't want to believe one set of results unless they've shown me several variations, then the results are robust. By the way, that's another hint, I think, for people in Georgia trying to do research. What I'm seeing now in the literature, in papers that I'm reviewing, is there was this real trend in development economics over the last 10 years to do field experiments and randomized controlled trials. You know, Esther Duflo has made a career as a future Nobel Prize winner doing a randomized controlled trial of blackboards in Botswana or whatever. What we're now realizing is that each of these randomized controlled trials is actually one draw from a distribution of results. And I don't really believe the results until I've got multiple draws. So in fact, there is a market for replication of results in development economics, particularly ones that look like they might or might not be generalizable. Georgia is such a different, Armenia are such different contexts from Africa, that if you take some of the important results that have gotten attention from Africa and replicate them in a South Caucasus setting, you're probably not going to hit a top journal, but you're probably going to get published in a reasonable journal. And those are quick and dirty master's theses. Anybody at the MA level with a good advisor, or any third-year program student, ought to be able to pick a good randomized controlled trial and replicate it. Okay, we're running out of time, so let me move fast. Never submit a paper until you've presented in at least one seminar. More is better. Never submit a paper until at least 2 colleagues have read it critically. And never submit a paper until you've finished it and slept on it for at least a week. I am surprised at the mistakes I find in my own work when I see it a week later. Okay, when you get a paper back, type 1, most papers. Learn from the comments. These are rejected ones. Digest the comments for a few days. Revise as soon as you can. Ashenfelter's law. Unemployed papers are worse than unemployed workers. At least unemployed workers get added leisure. Unemployed papers derive no utility from sitting on your disk drive. Unless you need unless there is a fundamental problem that you need new data or something, get it out within a month. Just get it out. Don't make the history of the paper too obvious. When you get a paper back, the revision request, now your chances of acceptance are not perfect, but they go up to better than 50%. Move as fast as you can. Adam's had this problem. You do not want the editor to change, or the referees to forget, or the referee to retire who like your paper, because then you're starting over again and there's such a stochastic element. Address every comment. Send a response showing numbered points. Referee comment 1, quote, here's how I responded. Referee comment 2, quote, here's how I responded. If the referee's wrong, be polite. Don't just say he's an idiot. Have a senior person review your response. That's what we're here for. Demand the IFC that they do that. Or if you're a researcher at ISET PI, demand of the faculty that they do that. Then's the time to be sure that the paper conforms to the journal styles. You don't need to redo the bibliography every time you send it to a different journal, even if that's already available in BibTech. When you get a paper back, acceptance. Read the galleys immediately. Don't change anything except actual errors. The one exception to that is always revise the references. The editors don't want to see you change galleys because that costs them even in electronic publishing, but they do want the references to be updated. And expect to get papers to referee. You will get them if your paper is accepted. That's the contract with the profession. Things to keep in mind. Have a portfolio of papers. Now I'm going to get to the really depressing numbers. Again, unemployment is not a good thing. Every paper should either be being worked on or under review at all times. With a 15% acceptance rate and 6 months on average to rejection to over a year to acceptance, if you want a high probability, let's say a 90% probability of getting one paper out a year, which is kind of, what we say is the tenure standard, you need to have 6 papers under review at any time. That's when you see people getting one paper a year on their CV, that's what they've got. Scary thought. 6 out at a time. Turning them over as soon as you get them back. Use co-authors. Make judicious use of co-authors. It's less and less, it's more and more common in economics. The average paper had 1.3 authors in 1970, now it's up to 2.3. They keep you motivated. Flip the order, flip a coin. Rotate your journal targets. Keep accurate records. Papers get rejected a lot. Editors know whether they've rejected a paper. I edit some journals. I've actually seen people send a paper back to the same journal 2 years later because they forgot that it had been rejected there. When you're asked to referee, it is your duty to the profession to do it. You have to. Remember how delays make you feel when you're an author. What would your discount rate have to be to make, you're going to spend the same amount of time refereeing the paper if you do it next month or in 8 months. You don't want to do it in no months because then the editor will keep sending you other things. But you don't want to be too late. If you think you're not going to be competent, even if you're going to take, what I will do is write an editor and typically say, okay, in my workload, I can do this paper. My expected time to turn around is 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it is. If I think I can't do it, you got to send it back as quickly as you can because it's unfair to the author to not look at it for 3 months and then say, oh, I don't know the stuff. Avoid double jeopardy. Now, what does that mean? That means if you've already rejected the paper for a journal and you get it for another journal, give the guy the benefit of the doubt with and let somebody else referee it. with one exception I'll talk about in a minute. If you are asked to referee, try and make your comments constructive. The optimal length of a referee report, I've gotten as long as 15 pages. That's unusual. But if you're not writing more than 1 page or so, you probably haven't done your job. Important, and young people have this problem. Referee the paper that the authors actually wrote, not the one that you would have written in their stead. It is appropriate to suggest alternative outlets. If you get a paper for a top journal and you think this paper is okay, but it's not of general interest enough for the JPE, you can say, I think the appropriate outlet for this paper might be Journal of Development Economics. In that case, double jeopardy is okay. If you've recommended that a paper go to another journal and the journal editor sends it to you, then it's fine to referee it again.
You do that with communication with the editor, or?
No. Oh, I might say to the editor in the cover letter, yes, here is my report of this on this paper. You should be aware that I suggested it be submitted to you when I rejected it for extra. Be very careful not to borrow things if you get a paper to referee. It's not kosher to reject the paper but steal the idea. And if you're sent a revision by an editor, don't use that as an opportunity to add things you didn't think of the first time. That's just totally unfair to an author. Remember, you aren't the only one who's been rejected. Some examples. The wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message to send to nobody in particular? That's what RCA said when it rejected the proposal to invest in radio broadcasting. It's impossible to sell animal stories in the US. That was a publisher's rejection of Animal Farm. The concept is interesting, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. Do you know what that one is?
FedEx.
That was the grade on the guy who proposed FedEx in his Harvard Business School paper. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out.
The Beatles.
Decca Records on the Beatles. Who the hell wants to copy a document on plain paper? Literally, with the H word. That was a rejection letter to the guys who invented Xerox, which was rejected by 20 firms before Xerox took it. Some examples in economics, just so you feel better. Here are famous papers that have been rejected, and this is only a partial list. Akerlof's Market for Lemons took 4 years between its first submission and its final publication. It was rejected by the AER, the JPE, and Restud. Bhagwati's and Mesmerizing Growth by the QJE, Black-Scholes by the JPE and Restat, Capital Asset Pricing by the Journal of Finance. They said it was too mathematical. Lucas Rational Expectations by the AER. Tulloch's Welfare Cost of Rent Seeking, AER, JPE, and Mohammed Feel Better. It was rejected by the Southern. So by transitivity property, your paper must be better than that one. Stoker Samuelson by the AER, Modigliani Life Cycle by Econometrica, Krugman by the QJE, EJ Hotelling, Skatowski. Tobit was rejected by JASA, and Tobin did not actually publish the paper on Tobit for 20 years, and everybody knew it. But it was not published until Tobin did a collected volume of his papers 20 years after he wrote it.
That's my strategy.
In 20 years from now.
Here are some memorable rejections. Keynes rejected Olin's factor proportion extra-Olin model, and the entire rejection was, this amounts to nothing and should be refused.
Keynes was wonderful.
Chamberlain rejected Buchanan's internal and external public debt. As a desk rejection, we cannot accept this article. That's all the feedback they got. So the best advice Richard Freeman gave us, rejection provides the certain knowledge that the editor and referees are blind baseball umpires members of the Three Stooges, or incompetents in even more drastic ways. And this is the best rejection letter ever. It's actual. We have read your manuscript with boundless delight. If we were to publish your paper, it would be impossible for us to publish any work of lower standard. As it is unthinkable that in the next 1,000 years we shall see its equal, we are, to our regret, compelled to return to divine composition and beg you 1,000 times to overlook our short sight and timidity. That's an actual rejection letter. It was a Chinese German. That's it. So I hope there were at least some useful hints in there.